I'm done supporting you. I sold your father's inheritance. Survive on your own. My son growled as my daughter-in-law nodded. I just smiled. I hope you're happy. When they landed in Milan and checked the balance, my phone rang nonstop, but fate was sealed.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
That Tuesday evening started like any other. I'd spent the afternoon preparing Richard's favorite pot roast, the same recipe I'd been making for 40 years. The dining room table was set with my good china, the kind Harold and I had received as wedding gifts. Fresh flowers from my garden sat in the center, and I'd even opened a bottle of the wine Harold had been saving for a special occasion. I should have known something was wrong when Richard arrived without calling first. He never just dropped by anymore, not since he married Jessica 3 years ago. But there he was at my front door at 6:30, his wife beside him wearing that cold smile I'd grown to recognize and dread. "Mom," Richard said, not bothering with his usual perfunctory hug. "We need to talk." Before I could respond, I heard car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the window, I saw 2 people in business suits getting out of a sedan, carrying clipboards and measuring devices. My stomach dropped. "Richard, who are those people?" Jessica stepped past me into my foyer like she owned the place. "Just some professionals we brought along. Don't worry about them." The strangers entered my home without invitation. The woman, blonde and sharp-suited, immediately began measuring the entryway with a laser device while the man started taking photographs of my living room furniture. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice shakier than I intended. "Sit down, Mom," Richard said, guiding me toward the kitchen while the real estate agents continued their work in my living room. "We have some things to discuss." I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Harold and I had shared breakfast every morning for 35 years. Jessica remained standing, her manicured fingers already drumming against the counter with impatience. "Mom, we've been doing some thinking," Richard began, not meeting my eyes. "About your situation here. This house is too big for you. The upkeep, the expenses, the responsibility. It's not fair to burden you with all of this." From the dining room, I could hear the agents opening and closing cabinet doors, their voices carrying as they discussed square footage and market value. They were treating my home like it was already for sale. "I don't understand," I said quietly. "I never said this house was a burden." Jessica laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Margaret, let's be realistic. You're 78 years old. You can barely manage the yard work, and the roof needs repairs you can't afford. We're trying to help you." 78. I was 68, but correcting Jessica had become pointless years ago. She had a way of making me feel ancient whenever it suited her purposes. "Help me how?" I asked. Richard finally looked at me directly, and what I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold. There was no warmth there, no trace of the little boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and broken toys. "We're going to sell the house, Mom. We've already started the process." "Started the process?" I stood up so quickly my chair scraped against the floor. "This is my house, Richard. Mine and your father's. You can't just—" "Actually, we can," Jessica interrupted, pulling out a folder from her purse. "Richard has power of attorney for your affairs. We had it drawn up last year when you were having those dizzy spells, remember?" I didn't remember signing anything like that. The dizzy spells had been a reaction to new blood pressure medication, nothing more. But looking at the legal documents Jessica spread across my kitchen table, I saw my signature on papers I had no memory of reviewing. From the living room came the sound of furniture being moved. I started toward the noise, but Jessica blocked my path. "Where do you think you're going?" "To see what they're doing to my things." "Your things?" Jessica's smile was predatory. "Margaret, once the house sells, we'll need to liquidate most of the contents. But don't worry. We'll let you keep some sentimental items." I pushed past her and nearly fainted at what I saw in my living room. The female agent was placing small red stickers on my furniture. My grandmother's antique secretary desk, Harold's leather recliner, the piano I'd played as a child. Each sticker read "Sold" in bold black letters. "Stop," I whispered, then louder. "Stop doing that. Those are my things." The agent looked at Jessica, who nodded slightly. "Mrs. Harrison, I understand this is difficult, but we need to assess which items will convey with the sale and which can be removed." "Removed where?" I demanded. Richard appeared beside me, his tone patronizing. "We found you a nice apartment, Mom. Senior living, very comfortable. You'll have much less to worry about." I watched in horror as Jessica moved through my dining room, casually placing stickers on the china cabinet that held 4 generations of family heirlooms. She paused at the mahogany table where Harold and I had hosted countless family dinners, running her finger along its polished surface before slapping a sticker on it too. "Not the dining set," I pleaded. "That was my mother's. It's been in the family for 70 years, yes, we know," Jessica said without looking up from her work. "But it won't fit in your new place. Besides, Richard and I have been needing a proper dining room set. This will be perfect for entertaining." She moved to my china cabinet next, opening it and examining the delicate pieces inside. These were the plates I'd eaten from as a child, the cups Harold had sipped his morning coffee from for decades. Jessica selected a few pieces, turning them over to check for maker's marks. "Most of this is too old-fashioned," she announced. "We'll donate what we can't use." I felt something crack inside my chest, a sound like kindling snapping. "You can't give away my mother's china." "We're not giving it away," Richard said. "We're making practical decisions about what you actually need. Mom, you have to understand, maintaining all these possessions at your age just isn't realistic." The real estate agents had moved upstairs now. I could hear their footsteps in Harold's study, in our bedroom, in the guest room where Richard used to stay when he visited with his first wife, back when he still visited regularly. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you been planning this?" Jessica and Richard exchanged a look. "The market analysis has been ongoing for about 6 months," Jessica said. "We wanted to make sure we got you the best possible price." 6 months. They'd been planning to sell my home for 6 months without telling me. "What about the other properties?" I asked. "Your father's rental house downtown? The cabin at the lake?" Another look passed between them, and I saw Richard swallow hard. "Mom, those have already been sold." "Already been sold?" The words came out as a whisper. "When?" "Over the past year," Jessica said matter-of-factly. "The rental income was barely covering the maintenance costs, and you never used the cabin anymore. We got excellent prices for both." I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter so hard my knuckles went white. "Where is the money?" "We've been investing it wisely," Richard said. "Setting things up for your future care, planning for contingencies." "Planning for contingencies," I repeated numbly. "Show me the accounts." Jessica's smile faltered slightly. "Margaret, you don't need to worry about the financial details. We're handling everything. Show me the accounts," I said more firmly. "Mom," Richard said, his patience clearly wearing thin, "you need to trust us on this. The money is being managed responsibly. When the house sells, you'll have everything you need for a comfortable retirement." From upstairs came the sound of drawers being opened, closets being measured. They were cataloging my entire life, deciding what had value and what could be discarded. That's when Jessica disappeared into the hallway and returned with a small cardboard box. She set it on the kitchen table with a soft thud. "We thought you might like to have these," she said with false sweetness. I opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside were family photographs, but many were torn or water-damaged. Pictures of Richard as a child, of Harold and me on our wedding day, of family vacations and birthday parties, all of them damaged beyond repair. At the bottom of the box was Harold's wedding ring, tarnished and scratched. "His ring," I whispered, lifting it from the box. "Why do you have Harold's ring?" "We had it appraised," Richard said quietly. "The gold isn't worth much, but we thought you'd want to keep it for sentimental reasons." They'd appraised Harold's wedding ring, the symbol of our 35-year marriage, reduced to its scrap metal value. I was still holding the ring when the full weight of their betrayal hit me. They hadn't just sold my properties, they'd stripped my husband's grave of everything valuable, treating his memory like inventory to be liquidated. "You had no right," I said, my voice barely audible. "We have every right," Jessica replied. "We're thinking about what's best for everyone, including you." I reached for the carving knife I'd used to slice the pot roast, intending to put it in the dishwasher. But as Jessica's words sank in, "We're thinking about what's best for everyone," My grip tightened involuntarily around the handle. The blade bit into my palm, opening a thin red line across my skin. Blood dripped onto the white kitchen tiles, but neither Richard nor Jessica noticed. They were too busy discussing listing prices and closing dates to see that their mother was bleeding. I wrapped my hand in a dish towel and watched them destroy my life with the casual efficiency of professional demolition workers. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside me. The woman who had raised Richard with infinite patience, who had welcomed Jessica into our family despite her obvious disdain, who had always put family harmony above her own needs, that woman began to die. In her place, something harder and more calculating was being born. "I hope you're both very happy," I said quietly, pressing the towel against my cut palm. Neither of them heard me. They were too busy planning their European vacation. The next morning, I woke up in what I didn't yet know would be my last night in the house Harold and I had called home for 38 years. My hand throbbed where the knife had cut me, a reminder that the previous evening hadn't been a nightmare. I made coffee in my kitchen, our kitchen, and sat at the table where Harold used to read the morning paper. Everything looked the same, but those red-soled stickers glared at me from every room like wounds that wouldn't heal. At 9 o'clock sharp, Richard arrived with a manila envelope and the same cold expression he'd worn the night before. "Morning, Mom. I brought the paperwork for your signature." I looked at the documents spread across my table. Sale contracts, property transfers, power of attorney confirmations, all requiring my signature to make their theft legal. What if I don't sign? Richard's jaw tightened. "Mom, we've been through this. The process is already in motion. You can make this easy or difficult, but the outcome will be the same. This is my house, Richard." "This is a house you can no longer maintain or afford," he corrected. "Jessica and I are trying to secure your future before you lose everything to medical bills or property taxes." I wanted to argue, to fight, but looking at my son's face, I saw Harold's stubborn chin and my own determined eyes turned against me. He truly believed he was saving me from myself. I signed the papers with a shaking hand, each signature feeling like I was signing my own death warrant. "There's one more thing," Richard said, not meeting my eyes. "We need to secure the house while the sale is processed, for insurance purposes." That afternoon, I discovered what secure the house meant. I'd gone to Miller's Hardware to buy bandages for my cut hand, and when I returned, the locks had been changed. I stood on my own front porch, key in hand, watching it turn uselessly in a lock that no longer recognized me. Through the window, I could see the real estate agents inside with Jessica, pointing at my furniture and making notes on their clipboards. I knocked on my own door, and Jessica answered with a surprised expression that didn't fool anyone. "Oh, Margaret! I didn't expect you back so soon. I need to get some things from upstairs. Personal items, documents." Jessica glanced over her shoulder at the agents, then back at me. "I'm afraid that's not possible right now. We're doing the final inventory, and insurance doesn't allow unauthorized personnel on the premises." Unauthorized personnel. That's what I had become in my own home. "I need my medication," I said. "It's in the bathroom medicine cabinet." "Of course," Jessica said with false sympathy. "I'll get it for you." She returned 5 minutes later with a small paper bag containing 3 prescription bottles. As she handed it to me, I noticed she was already wearing my mother's pearl earrings, the ones from the jewelry box in my bedroom dresser. "Those are mine," I said quietly. Jessica's hand flew to her ear, feigning surprise. "Oh, these old things. I found them loose in a drawer upstairs. I didn't want them to get lost during the move. My mother had worn those pearls to my wedding. I'd planned to give them to my future daughter-in-law someday, back when I thought Richard would marry someone who might actually love our family." "I'd like them back, please." Jessica's smile never wavered. "Of course, once we sort through all the jewelry properly. We want to make sure you get everything that's truly valuable." She closed the door in my face. I spent that night at the Comfort Inn on Route 9, paying with my credit card and wondering how many more nights I could afford. The next morning, I walked to the bank to check my accounts and discovered that Jessica hadn't been entirely wrong about my financial situation, but not for the reasons she'd implied. "Mrs. Harrison," said Janet, the teller I'd known for 15 years. I'm sorry, but there seems to be a hold on your accounts pending some estate verification. Estate verification? But I'm not dead. Janet looked uncomfortable. The notation says it's related to power of attorney documentation. You'd need to speak with Mr. Chen in customer service. Mr. Chen, who looked young enough to be my grandson, explained that Richard had placed a freeze on my accounts for my protection while the estate was being reorganized. How am I supposed to live while this is being reorganized? Well, Mr. Chen said, consulting his computer screen, it shows here that arrangements have been made for your essential expenses to be covered by the power of attorney holder. You just need to submit receipts for approval. Submit receipts to my own son for permission to spend my own money. I walked toward what used to be my home, and found a sold sign planted in the front yard like a gravestone. The house looked different somehow, smaller and shabbier than it had the day before. Jessica had already begun stripping it of its dignity. Mrs. Patterson from next door was watering her flowers when she saw me standing on the sidewalk. "Oh, Margaret," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "I heard about your situation. Such a shame when children can't manage their own affairs and have to burden their elderly parents." I stared at her. "I beg your pardon?" "Well, Richard explained everything to Tom last weekend. How you'd been struggling with the finances, getting confused about bills, that sort of thing. It's so common at your age. Tom's mother went through the same thing before we had to put her in Sunset Manor. The lies were already spreading through the neighborhood like poison. Richard had painted me as a confused old woman who couldn't manage her own life, and Jessica was rewriting our family history to make themselves the heroes of their own cruel narrative." "I see," I said quietly. "And what else did Richard tell you?" Mrs. Patterson leaned closer, clearly enjoying her role as neighborhood gossip. "He said you'd been having memory problems, forgetting to pay bills, leaving the stove on. Jessica showed me the lovely apartment they found for you at Autumn Acres, much more appropriate for someone in your condition. Someone in my condition, as if age itself were a disease that required quarantine." I walked away before Mrs. Patterson could share any more of Richard and Jessica's fiction, but I could feel her watching me, probably already composing her next report to the other neighbors about poor Margaret's decline. That evening, I sat in my hotel room with a cup of instant coffee and tried to make sense of what had happened to my life. In less than 48 hours, I'd lost my home, my possessions, my financial independence, and apparently my reputation in the community where I'd lived for 4 decades. My phone buzzed with a notification from Facebook. Without thinking, I opened the app and immediately wished I hadn't. Jessica had posted a photo of herself and Richard at an expensive restaurant downtown, champagne glasses raised in celebration. The caption read, "Finally got Mom's estate situation sorted out. Time to celebrate a successful week. She blessed shucked her family first Milan bound." The comments below made my stomach turn. "You two are such good children for taking care of her. It's so hard when parents get to that age where they need extra help. You're doing the right thing, even if she doesn't understand it now." Jessica had crafted the narrative perfectly. She and Richard weren't greedy adult children stealing their mother's inheritance. They were martyrs, sacrificing their own comfort to care for a burdensome elderly relative who couldn't appreciate their generosity. I scrolled through more of Jessica's recent posts and found a photo gallery that made me nauseated. Pictures of estate sale finds, my mother's china displayed in Jessica's dining room, Harold's leather chair in their living room, my grandmother's quilt draped artfully over their sofa. She was parading my life like trophies, and her friends were commenting with heart-eyed emojis and congratulations on her gorgeous antique finds. The final insult came when I tried to comment on the post, only to discover that Jessica had blocked me on all social media platforms. I couldn't defend myself, couldn't correct the lies, couldn't even see what other fabrications they were spreading about my supposed incompetence. I tried calling Richard's cell phone, but the number went straight to a message saying it had been disconnected. When I called his work, his secretary told me politely that Mr. Harrison was traveling abroad and wouldn't be reachable for 2 weeks. 2 weeks! They were fleeing the country before I could fully comprehend what they'd done to me. On the 3rd day, I swallowed my pride and walked to Autumn Acres, the senior living facility where Richard claimed to have arranged my future accommodations. The receptionist, a woman named Carol with kind eyes and graying hair, looked confused when I gave my name. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrison, but I don't see any reservation or application under your name. Are you sure you have the right facility? My son Richard said he'd made arrangements." Carol checked her computer again, then shook her head. "I'm afraid not. And I should mention, our waiting list for residency is currently 18 months for a standard apartment, longer for anything with assisted care services. 18 months. Richard had lied about the apartment, just like he'd lied about everything else. There was no plan for my care, no safety net, no consideration for what would happen to me once they'd liquidated everything I owned. I walked out of Autumn Acres and kept walking, with no destination in mind, until my feet carried me to the small park where I used to take Richard when he was a child. I sat on the same bench where I'd pushed his stroller 30 years ago, where I'd taught him to tie his shoes, where I'd bandaged his scraped knees and told him everything would be all right. That's where I was sitting when I found the piece of paper that would change everything, a crumpled receipt that had fallen from Jessica's purse during their house raid, now blown by the wind into the bushes beside my bench. It was a confirmation printout for their Milan vacation. First-class flights, 5-star hotels, private tours, designer shopping excursions, a 2-week itinerary that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The total at the bottom made me dizzy. $47,000. $47,000. More than I'd spent on anything except the house itself, being blown on a vacation to celebrate my destruction. I folded the receipt carefully and put it in my purse. I didn't know why yet, but something told me I might need evidence of their extravagance later. As the sun set over the park where I'd once felt safe and loved, I realized that the woman who had raised Richard with infinite patience and unconditional love was truly dead. In her place sat someone harder, someone who was beginning to understand that survival might require weapons I'd never thought I'd need to use. My phone buzzed one last time. Another Facebook notification I couldn't see, another lie I couldn't refute, another celebration of my downfall that I was powerless to stop. But sitting there in the growing darkness, clutching that expensive receipt, I began to suspect that my powerlessness might be more temporary than Richard and Jessica imagined. I'd been living at the Comfort Inn for a week when the manager, Mr. Rodriguez, approached me with obvious discomfort during breakfast. "Mrs. Harrison, I hate to mention this, but your card was declined last night when we tried to process your room charge." I wasn't surprised. Richard's expense approval system had proven to be a cruel joke. Every receipt I submitted was either rejected as unnecessary or ignored entirely. I'd been surviving on the $23 in cash I'd had in my purse when they changed the locks. "I understand," I said quietly. "I'll settle up today and check out." "Where will you go?" Mr. Rodriguez asked, his voice gentle. He'd been kind to me during my stay, never making me feel like the charity case I'd become. "I have some things to collect from storage," I lied. "Family items from the house sale." The truth was, I had nowhere to go. The Salvation Army shelter had a 6-week waiting list, and the women's shelters were reserved for victims of domestic violence, though what Richard and Jessica had done to me felt violent enough. But I did have one place left to visit, though I'd been avoiding it for emotional reasons. Harold's study had been converted to storage after his death 3 years ago, filled with boxes I'd never had the heart to sort through. If Richard and Jessica had been thorough, they would have gone through everything. But knowing Jessica's impatience with anything that didn't have obvious monetary value, I suspected they might have missed something. The house still felt like violation when I approached it that afternoon. The sold sign now had a red pending banner across it, and I could see Jessica's car in the driveway. I waited across the street until she left, then used the one access point they'd forgotten about, the basement entrance through Harold's workshop. The spare key was still hidden where we'd kept it for 20 years, under the third loose brick by the cellar door. Some habits die hard, even when everything else is being demolished. I let myself into the basement and stood in the familiar darkness, breathing in the smell of Harold's wood stain and machine oil. This space, at least, felt untouched by their destruction. The real estate agents had clearly deemed it too cluttered and dark to bother with detailed inventory. Harold's workbench was exactly as he'd left it 3 years ago, his tools arranged with the precision of a surgeon. I'd never understood his need for such organization, but standing there now, I found comfort in the familiar order of his world. The boxes from his study were stacked against the far wall, labeled in my own handwriting, Harold's papers, legal documents, business files. I'd been too overwhelmed with grief to sort through them after the funeral, and later, they'd seemed like painful reminders of everything I'd lost. Now they might be my only hope. I started with the box labeled legal documents, expecting to find copies of our will, insurance policies, the usual paperwork of a long marriage. What I found instead made no sense at first. There were deeds to properties I didn't recognize, addresses in other states, LLC formations for companies with names I'd never heard Harold mention, investment statements from banks I'd never banked with, stock certificates for corporations that meant nothing to me. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in an oilcloth that still smelled faintly of Harold's cologne, was an envelope marked, "For Margaret, emergency only," in his careful handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter, written in Harold's familiar script, and a small brass key. "My dearest Margaret," it began, and I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside me in his favorite chair. "If you are reading this letter, it means our son has become the man I always feared he might become. Someone who sees his parents as obstacles rather than people who love him. I've watched Richard grow increasingly interested in what we have rather than who we are, and I've prepared for the possibility that my death might bring out the worst in him. What you thought you knew about our finances was only part of the story. I never wanted to burden you with the complexities of what I'd built, but I also couldn't risk leaving you vulnerable if my suspicions about Richard proved correct. The key in this envelope opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank on Market Street, box number 1247. Inside, you'll find documents that explain everything: the real extent of our holdings, the trusts I established, the properties held in your name through various entities, the house you're living in, the rentals downtown, the lake cabin. Those were what I called our visible assets. I let Richard see those because I wanted him to think he understood our situation. But Margaret, my love, what he saw was less than 20% of what we actually built together. You remember my first big case, 30 years ago? The patent litigation for Michaels Industries that made the newspapers? What I never told you was that instead of taking the standard fee, I negotiated for stock options in the company. Those options became worth millions when Michaels went public in 1995. I used those gains to quietly purchase real estate, to invest in emerging technologies, to create a network of holdings that would protect you if anything ever happened to me. Every successful case, every good investment, I put half of the profits into what I called our insurance policy against the future. There's a house in Vermont that's been in your name for 15 years. You've never seen it, but it's beautiful. By a lake much prettier than our cabin. There's an apartment building in Portland that generates more rental income in a month than Richard makes in 6. There are stock portfolios and bond funds and investment accounts that I managed through a financial advisor who has instructions to work only with you. I never told you about any of this because I didn't want you to worry about managing it, and I didn't want Richard to know it existed until he proved he could handle the responsibility of family wealth. Based on the fact that you're reading this letter, I assume he has failed that test spectacularly. The financial advisor's name is James Morton at Morton & Associates. He's been expecting to hear from you since the day I died, and he has copies of all the documents you'll need to access everything. Tell him the phrase Blue Mountain Sunrise. It's our code, and he'll know you found this letter. Margaret, you are not poor. You are not helpless. You are not at the mercy of our son's greed or his wife's ambitions. What they stole from you was pocket change compared to what they don't know exists. I'm sorry you had to discover this under such painful circumstances, but I'm glad you found the strength to look for it. Use what I've left you not just to survive, but to rebuild your life exactly as you want it. And if Richard has truly become the selfish man I feared he might be, don't feel guilty about protecting yourself from him. Family is supposed to be about love and loyalty, not exploitation. If he chose exploitation, then he chose to break the family bond himself. I love you more than all the money in all these accounts. but I hope this money will let you live the rest of your life with dignity and peace. Forever yours, Harold P.S. Check the loose floorboard under my workbench. Third board from the left. I left you something there, too. I read the letter 3 times before the words truly sank in. Harold had known. Somehow he'd seen Richard's true nature years before I was willing to admit it, and he'd spent decades quietly building a fortress around me. The floorboard he'd mentioned was easy to find. It wobbled slightly when I stepped on it. Underneath was a small metal box containing cash, jewelry I'd never seen before, and another key with a tag that read, Safe Deposit Box 1248, for immediate expenses. 2 safety deposit boxes. Harold had been thorough. I sat on his workbench and cried for the first time since this nightmare began. Not tears of despair, but tears of relief so profound they shook my entire body. My husband, even 3 years after his death, was still protecting me. But the tears didn't last long, because sitting in Harold's basement workshop, surrounded by evidence of his foresight and love, I began to understand something else. This wasn't just about my survival anymore. This was about justice. Richard and Jessica had built their betrayal on the assumption that I was powerless, that I had nowhere to turn, that I would eventually accept their version of reality because I had no choice. They'd counted on my love for Richard to make me complicit in my own destruction. They'd been wrong about everything. I gathered up all the documents, locked Harold's workshop, and walked back to my car with my head higher than it had been in days. I had phone calls to make and accounts to access. But first, I was going to do something I should have done the moment I found that expensive vacation receipt. I was going to learn exactly how much money Richard and Jessica were planning to spend, celebrating their theft of what they thought was my entire inheritance. My phone buzzed as I drove toward downtown, a text from a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Harrison, this is James Morton from Morton & Associates. I've been trying to reach you since Mr. Harrison's passing. When you're ready to discuss your financial portfolio, please call me. I have some things that belong to you. Harold's advisor had been waiting 3 years for me to find that letter, which meant for 3 years, while I'd been struggling with Richard's increasing coldness and Jessica's obvious disdain, there had been someone who knew exactly what my husband had left me, someone who'd been watching and waiting for me to claim what was rightfully mine. I pulled over and called the number immediately. Mrs. Harrison? James Morton's voice was warm with relief. I was beginning to worry I'd never hear from you. Did you find Harold's letter? Blue Mountain Sunrise, I said, and I could practically hear him smiling through the phone. Wonderful. How soon can you come to my office? We have a great deal to discuss, and based on some recent activity I've been monitoring, I suspect time may be of the essence. Recent activity? Let's just say your son and daughter-in-law have been making some very public financial decisions lately. Decisions that suggest they believe they've acquired more resources than they actually have. As I drove toward Morton & Associates, I realized that Harold's letter had given me more than financial security. It had given me something far more valuable, the power to choose how this story would end. Richard and Jessica were in Milan right now, probably posting more photos of their expensive celebration, secure in their belief that they'd successfully eliminated me as a factor in their lives. They were about to learn how wrong they were about that, too. James Morton's office occupied the entire top floor of a glass building downtown, the kind of place I would have been intimidated to enter just a week ago. Now, walking through the marble lobby in my discount store clothes, I felt like I was finally coming home to a world that had been waiting for me. Morton himself was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the slick, suit-wearing stereotype I'd imagined, he was a gentleman in his 60s with kind eyes and Harold's same methodical way of organizing papers on his desk. Margaret, he said, standing as his secretary showed me in. I'm so glad you finally found Harold's letter. He was very specific about when and how you should be contacted. He knew this would happen? Morton gestured to a comfortable chair across from his desk. Harold was one of the most perceptive men I ever worked with. He loved Richard, but he saw warning signs that concerned him deeply. The way your son talked about money, about inheritance, about what he felt he was owed from your family's success. He pulled out a thick folder marked with my name. Harold started planning for this possibility about 5 years ago, after Richard's divorce from his first wife. Do you remember how Richard behaved during that settlement? I did remember. Richard had been furious that his ex-wife was entitled to half of what he called his assets, even though most of their wealth had come from gifts and loans from Harold and me. He'd ranted for months about how unfair it was that she could claim money she hadn't earned. Harold was worried that Richard saw family money as his birthright rather than something to be grateful for. And when Richard married Jessica, Morton shook his head. Harold called me after their first Christmas together. Said he'd never seen someone inventory a house so thoroughly while pretending to admire the decorations. Morton opened the folder and began spreading documents across his desk. Bank statements, property deeds, investment portfolios, page after page of assets I'd never known existed. Let's start with the basics, Morton said. What Richard sold. Your house, the downtown rental, the lake cabin, represented about 18% of your total holdings. 18%. They'd destroyed my life over 18% of what Harold had actually left me. The house in Vermont I mentioned in Harold's letter is worth about $2 million. The Portland apartment building generates $34,000 monthly in rental income. There are stock portfolios, bond funds, CDs at various banks, and 3 more rental properties in different states. Morton turned his computer screen toward me, showing a financial summary that made me dizzy. The total at the bottom was more money than I'd ever imagined existing in one place, let alone belonging to me. Harold was very specific about how this should be handled if Richard ever proved untrustworthy. He wanted you to have absolute control over all assets, with no possibility of Richard claiming any legal right to them. How is that possible? Aren't children entitled to their parents' inheritance? Morton smiled. Not when the parent is still alive and the assets were always legally hers to begin with. Harold was clever about this, Margaret. Everything is in your name, held in trust through various entities, but you're the sole beneficiary and decision-maker. Richard never had any legal claim to any of it. I thought about Richard and Jessica celebrating in Milan, spending money from the sale of properties that represented such a tiny fraction of what was actually available. It would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. There's something else, Morton continued. Harold left specific instructions about what to do if Richard ever attempted what he called financial elder abuse. Would you like to hear those instructions? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Morton pulled out another document, this one in Harold's handwriting. Harold wrote, "If Richard steals from Margaret, he needs to understand that theft has consequences. Use whatever resources necessary to ensure he faces the full legal and financial ramifications of his choices. Margaret should not have to be merciful to someone who showed her no mercy." What does that mean, practically? It means we can pursue criminal charges for financial elder abuse. It means we can freeze any accounts where stolen money was deposited. It means we can make Richard's theft very expensive for him to enjoy. Morton opened his laptop and showed me Richard's recent financial activity. I've been monitoring the accounts where your property sale money was deposited. Your son and daughter-in-law have been spending quite liberally. The activity log read like a catalog of excess, luxury hotels, first-class flights, designer shopping, expensive restaurants. In just 1 week, they'd spent more than I used to earn in a year. They're in Milan now, I said. Yes, I saw the charges. They seem to believe they have unlimited resources. Morton looked at me carefully. Margaret, I need to ask you something, and please be honest. Do you want to stop them, or do you want to destroy them? The question hung in the air between us. A week ago, I would have been horrified by such a choice. The old Margaret would have chosen forgiveness, would have found ways to excuse Richard's behavior, would have prioritized family peace over personal justice, but that Margaret had died the night Jessica put "sold" stickers on my furniture. I want them to understand what they've done, I said quietly. I want them to face consequences that match the cruelty of their choices. Morton nodded. Then we have work to do. Start over the next 2 hours. Morton laid out what he called Harold's nuclear option, a comprehensive plan for not just recovering my stolen assets, but ensuring Richard and Jessica would regret their choices for years to come. First, we would freeze all accounts containing money from my property sales, triggering fraud investigations that would prevent Richard and Jessica from accessing any of their ill-gotten gains. Second, we would file criminal charges for financial elder abuse, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and fraud. Third, we would use civil courts to recover not just the stolen money, but damages for emotional distress and punitive awards that would bankrupt them. But Harold's real stroke of genius, Morton said, was this. He showed me documents establishing a charitable foundation in Harold's name, with me as the sole board member. All of your assets can be transferred to this foundation, making you the administrator of a multi-million-dollar charity focused on helping elderly victims of financial abuse. What does that accomplish? It means Richard can never claim any inheritance, ever. It means the money will be used to help people who've suffered exactly what you've suffered, and it means you'll have unlimited resources to ensure that predators like Richard and Jessica face consequences for their actions. Morton leaned forward. Margaret, your husband left you more than money. He left you power. The question is, are you prepared to use it? I thought about Mrs. Patterson's pity, about Richard's lies to the neighbors, about Jessica wearing my mother's pearl earrings while she locked me out of my own home. I thought about the $47,000 vacation receipt in my purse and the social media posts celebrating my destruction. What's the first step? I asked. Morton smiled. We make some phone calls. The first call was to the bank where Richard had deposited the proceeds from my property sales. Morton's law firm carried enough weight that the bank manager agreed to freeze the accounts pending an investigation into suspected elder financial abuse. The second call was to the credit card companies handling Richard and Jessica's European spending spree. Within an hour, every card connected to the stolen money would be declined. The third call was to a private investigator Morton had worked with before. We need documentation of every cent they've spent, every lie they've told, every public statement they've made about Margaret's supposed incompetence. By the time we finished, Richard and Jessica's financial lifeline had been severed completely. They were stranded in one of the most expensive cities in the world with no access to the money they'd stolen, no credit cards, and no way to get home except by admitting to their friends and family that they'd somehow lost access to their resources. How long before they realize what's happened? I asked. Based on their spending pattern, I'd guess they'll hit their first decline transaction sometime this evening, Milan time. By tomorrow, they'll be in full panic mode. Morton handed me a folder containing my own new credit cards, bank access codes, and property deeds. These are yours now, Margaret. Your Vermont house is fully furnished and ready for you to move in whenever you want. Your monthly income from the various properties and investments is about $47,000. Coincidentally, the same amount Richard and Jessica are about to discover they can't afford to spend. $47,000 a month. More than most people made in a year, coming to me every month for the rest of my life. There's one more thing, Morton said, opening a small safe behind his desk. Harold left this for you. Inside was my grandmother's engagement ring, the one I thought had been lost decades ago. Attached to it was a note. For Margaret. Your grandmother would be proud of the strength you found. Wear this and remember that you come from a long line of women who didn't let anyone diminish them. As I slipped the ring onto my finger, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about recovering from Richard and Jessica's betrayal anymore. This was about reclaiming the power I'd spent a lifetime giving away to people who didn't deserve it. Morton walked me to the elevator. What will you do now? I thought about Richard and Jessica, probably getting dressed for another expensive dinner in Milan, confident in their victory over the pathetic old woman they'd so easily disposed of. I think I'll go shopping, I said. It's been a long time since I bought myself something nice. My phone buzzed as the elevator doors closed. A text from an Italian number I didn't recognize, probably Richard, using Jessica's international phone to contact me from their luxury vacation. I deleted the message without reading it. Whatever desperate plea or angry accusation it contained, I wasn't interested. I had learned something valuable from Harold's letter and Morton's guidance. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is simply refusing to be available for it. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone was buzzing continuously with calls and texts from multiple international numbers. Richard and Jessica were clearly discovering that their stolen fortune had evaporated, and they were panicking. I turned off my phone and walked out into the afternoon sunshine, feeling lighter than I had in years. Tomorrow, I would start the process of pressing criminal charges. Next week, I would move into my beautiful Vermont house and begin my new life. But today, I was going to buy myself the kind of outfit that would make Jessica's designer clothes look like bargain basement remnants. And then, I was going to have dinner at the most expensive restaurant in town, where I would toast Harold's memory and the justice he'd made possible. The game had changed completely, and Richard and Jessica were about to discover they'd been playing against an opponent they'd never bothered to understand. I woke up in my suite at the Four Seasons, sheets softer than anything I'd felt in years, with sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the city where I'd lived my entire life but had never seen from this perspective. The view from the top was remarkably different. Morton had insisted I stay somewhere appropriate to my actual financial status, while I decided where to make my permanent home. The suite cost more per night than my old monthly grocery budget, but looking at my bank statements over room service coffee, I realized that my old way of thinking about money had been as much a prison as Richard and Jessica's lies. Harold had left me rich. Not comfortable, not secure. Rich. The kind of rich that comes with responsibilities and power I was still learning to understand. My phone had 47 missed calls from international numbers and dozens of increasingly desperate text messages. I finally turned it back on and scrolled through Richard and Jessica's progression from confusion to panic to rage. The first message, from yesterday evening, Milan time, was almost casual. "Mom, having some trouble with our cards. Can you call the bank and sort this out?" By midnight their time, the tone had shifted. "Urgent. All our accounts are frozen. Something is wrong. Need you to fix this immediately." This morning's messages were pure desperation. "Mom, we're stranded. No access to money. The hotel is threatening to call police. Call me now." The most recent message, sent an hour ago, revealed how completely they'd missed the point. "We know you're behind this somehow. When we get home, you'll pay for this petty revenge. You can't treat family this way." I couldn't treat family this way. The irony was remarkable. I ordered more coffee and called Morton. "How are our friends doing overseas?" Exactly as we predicted. The private investigator I hired has contacts in Milan who've been documenting their situation. "Would you like a report?" "Please." "They're currently in the lobby of the Hotel Principe di Savoia, arguing with management about their bill. Hotel security has been called twice. Jessica threw quite a scene when her card was declined at Bulgari yesterday, and several people recorded it on their phones. I felt no satisfaction in their humiliation, but I felt no pity either. They'd designed this situation themselves when they decided to build their luxury vacation on money stolen from someone they'd systematically degraded and dismissed. What's their next move likely to be? Based on the investigator's assessment, they'll probably try to contact friends or family for emergency funds. When that fails, they'll have to accept whatever help the American consulate can provide for stranded citizens, which typically means a loan for basic transportation home, and not much else. I thought about Richard and Jessica's social circle, the same people who'd attended that disastrous dinner where everything began, the couples who'd witnessed my humiliation, who'd listened to Jessica's lies about my supposed incompetence, who'd admired my stolen furniture in Jessica's social media posts. "Morton, I want to do something that might seem petty." "I'm listening." "Richard and Jessica will be calling their friends for help. I want those friends to know the truth about why they're stranded." "What did you have in mind?" "A party, a celebration of Harold's life and the foundation we're establishing in his name. I want to invite everyone who knew us, everyone who's heard Jessica's version of recent events. I want them to understand who I really am and what really happened to my family's assets." Morton was quiet for a moment. "Margaret, that's not petty. That's strategic. When would you like to host this event?" "Tomorrow evening. I want it to happen while Richard and Jessica are still trapped in Milan, still desperately calling everyone they know for money." "I'll handle the arrangements. The foundation launch will give us a perfect reason to explain the real financial situation, and your presence as the hostess will make it clear who's actually in control." After I hung up with Morton, I spent the morning doing something I hadn't done in years. shopping for myself without checking price tags. At Nordstrom, the personal shopper assigned to me listened carefully as I explained what I needed. I want to look like someone who's never worried about money, I told her. Not flashy, not trying too hard, just quietly expensive. She understood perfectly. By afternoon, I had a wardrobe that whispered power instead of shouting it, cashmere sweaters that felt like clouds, perfectly tailored pants, shoes that cost more than my old monthly car payment but felt like walking on air. The transformation wasn't just external. Looking at myself in the dressing room mirror, I saw someone I barely recognized, a woman who took up space, who expected quality, who moved through the world as if she belonged in it. As the personal shopper packed my purchases, my phone rang with a call from an unlisted international number. I answered out of curiosity. Margaret? Jessica's voice was high-pitched with stress. Thank God. We've been trying to reach you for hours. I've been busy. We need you to call the bank immediately. There's been some kind of mistake with the accounts. We're stuck here and I know where you are, Jessica. I know about the hotel bill, the declined cards, the scene at Bulgari. I know everything. Silence. Then Richard's voice in the background. Let me talk to her. Mom, Richard said, his familiar tone of forced patience. We need you to fix this financial mix-up so we can come home and sort everything out properly. There's no mix-up, Richard. What do you mean? I mean, I know about Harold's real will. I know about the assets you never found. I know that you stole 18% of my inheritance and thought you'd taken everything. Another silence, longer this time. I could hear them whispering frantically, Mom, you're not making sense. You were confused about the finances, remember? That's why we had to step in and… I was never confused, Richard. I was trusting. There's a difference, though I understand why you'd prefer to think I was simply incompetent rather than betrayed. Jessica grabbed the phone. Margaret, I don't know what lies someone has been telling you, but we're your family. We've been taking care of you, protecting your interests. By changing the locks on my house, by freezing my bank accounts, by selling my possessions and calling me a pauper, we were helping you downsize, helping you transition to a more manageable lifestyle. You were stealing from me, I said calmly. And now you're experiencing what it feels like to have no resources, no support, no one who cares about your situation. How does it feel? You can't do this to us, Richard said, taking the phone back. We're family. Family doesn't steal from each other, Richard. Family doesn't humiliate each other. Family doesn't lock elderly parents out of their own homes and spread lies about their mental competence. When we get home, you'll find that home has changed considerably. I'll be hosting a gathering tomorrow evening to announce Harold's foundation and to clarify some misconceptions about our family's financial situation. Your friends will be attending. I think they'll find the truth quite illuminating. You wouldn't dare. Richard, in the past week, I've learned that I'll dare quite a lot when properly motivated. Enjoy the rest of your vacation. I understand the American consulate has a loan program for stranded citizens, though I believe it requires admitting that you've mismanaged your finances abroad. I hung up and immediately blocked both their numbers. Whatever happened to them next would happen without my involvement or assistance. That evening, I had dinner at the hotel's rooftop restaurant, wearing one of my new cashmere sweaters and my grandmother's ring. The maitre d' treated me with the deference reserved for hotel guests whose suites cost more than most people's monthly salaries, and I found myself settling into that treatment as if I'd been born to it. At the next table, a couple was arguing quietly about their credit card being declined for dessert. The woman looked embarrassed while the man made increasingly angry phone calls to customer service. 6 months ago, I would have offered to help. Tonight, I simply enjoyed my wine and watched the sunset over a city that finally felt like it belonged to me. My phone buzzed with a message from Morton. Foundation event confirmed for tomorrow, 7 p.m. at the Riverside Country Club. 43 guests confirmed, including all the couples from the dinner party where this began. Press release about Harold's foundation and your role as administrator goes out tomorrow morning. By the time Richard and Jessica land, assuming they find a way home, everyone they know will understand the real story. I raised my wine glass to the empty chair across from me. Thank you, Harold, I whispered. You always were 10 steps ahead of everyone else." Below me, the city sparkled with lights from thousands of homes where families were having their evening conversations, making their plans, living their ordinary lives. Somewhere among those lights was my old house, now empty, and waiting for new owners who would never know the heartbreak that had happened within its walls. Tomorrow, I would stand in front of people who had witnessed my humiliation and show them the woman who had emerged from that destruction. I would launch Harold's foundation with the same grace and competence he'd always shown in his professional life. And while I did that, Richard and Jessica would be discovering that the American Consulate's Emergency Assistance Program was designed for genuinely desperate tourists, not for spoiled adults who'd gambled their stolen money on living beyond their means. The last message I'd received from them had been sent 4 hours ago. "We'll never forgive you for this." They'd never forgive me, as if forgiveness were something they had a right to grant or withhold, as if they were the injured parties in this situation. I turned off my phone and ordered another glass of wine. Tomorrow would be time enough to begin my new life publicly. Tonight, I wanted to savor the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice, delayed by grief and trust and love, had finally arrived, and it had arrived with interest. The Riverside Country Club's ballroom had been transformed into something Harold would have loved, elegant but warm, sophisticated but welcoming. Fresh flowers filled every corner, and photographs of Harold's legal career and our family's happier moments lined the walls. Notably absent were any pictures featuring Richard from the past 5 years. I stood at the entrance in a midnight blue dress that cost more than I used to spend on clothing in a year, greeting guests who couldn't quite hide their shock at my transformation. Mrs. Patterson, who had whispered about my decline just 2 weeks ago, now approached with obvious confusion. "Margaret, you look wonderful. I had no idea you were hosting this event." "Thank you, Helen. I'm glad you could come to celebrate Harold's foundation." Behind her, I could see the couples from that disastrous birthday dinner, the same people who had witnessed Jessica put sold stickers on my furniture. They clustered together, whispering and glancing at me with expressions that mixed bewilderment with growing embarrassment. Morton approached with a satisfied smile. "The guest list is complete, and the press release has been picked up by the Business Journal. By morning, Harold's foundation will be front-page news. Any word from our travelers?" The investigator's final report came in an hour ago. Richard and Jessica spent yesterday in the American Consulate, applying for emergency repatriation loans. They'll be flying home tomorrow on standby tickets, middle seats, with a requirement to repay the government within 90 days. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morton announced, calling the room to attention, "thank you for joining us tonight to honor Harold Harrison's memory and to launch the foundation that will continue his legacy of protecting vulnerable adults from financial exploitation." The room settled into attentive silence. These were people who had known Harold professionally and socially, who had respected his judgment and integrity. What they were about to learn would reframe everything they thought they understood about recent events. "Many of you know that Harold's wife, Margaret, has recently experienced some family challenges," Morton continued. "What you may not know is that Harold, with his characteristic foresight, had prepared for exactly this situation." Morton gestured to me. "Margaret Harrison is not, as some rumors have suggested, a confused elderly woman who needed her children to manage her affairs. She is, and always has been, the primary beneficiary of Harold's estate. An estate worth significantly more than most people realized." A murmur ran through the room. I could see Jessica's friends exchanging glances, beginning to understand that something was very wrong with the story they'd been told. Morton pulled up a slide showing the foundation's initial endowment. The number on the screen, $12 million, caused audible gasps throughout the room. I stepped forward, my voice steady and clear. 2 weeks ago, Richard and Jessica systematically stole what they thought was my entire inheritance: my house, the rental properties, even Harold's personal belongings. What they didn't realize was that they'd stolen less than 20% of what Harold actually left me. The room erupted in shocked whispers. These were people who had seen Jessica's social media posts celebrating her estate sale finds, who had believed Richard's stories about my supposed incompetence. Dr. Hendricks, who had been at the birthday dinner, stood up slowly. Are you saying that when Jessica was showing off your mother's china at her house, it was actually stolen property? That's exactly what I'm saying. Every piece of furniture, every family heirloom, every photograph they claimed to be managing for my benefit was taken from me without my knowledge or consent. Carol Morrison, Jessica's closest friend, looked pale. But the apartment you were supposed to move into didn't exist. There was no apartment, no care plan, no consideration for my actual needs. Richard lied to you, just like he lied to me. The silence was absolute now. These people were realizing they'd been accessories to financial elder abuse, that they'd believed lies designed to cover up theft. Where are they now? Someone asked. Stranded in Milan, I said calmly. When the theft was discovered and the accounts frozen, they lost access to their stolen funds. They're currently seeking emergency assistance from the American consulate to get home. 3 days later, I was in my Vermont house for the first time. Harold had been right. It was beautiful, situated on a lake much prettier than our old cabin, surrounded by mountains that turned gold in the afternoon sun. I was arranging books in Harold's study when my phone rang. Morton's name appeared on the screen. They're back, he said simply. How did they take the news? Richard's reaction was explosive. When he discovered that the house had been sold to a family who paid cash and moved in immediately, he tried to break down the front door. The new owners called police, and Richard was arrested for trespassing. And Jessica? Currently staying with her parents, who have apparently been receiving very angry phone calls from creditors. It seems Jessica used her parents' credit to extend their European spending when their card stopped working. Even in desperation, Jessica had found a way to destroy other people's financial security. The criminal charges have been filed, Morton continued. Richard's assets have been frozen pending investigation. His lawyer is suggesting he might be willing to negotiate. What kind of negotiation? Full confession, complete asset forfeiture, and agreement to a plea that includes significant prison time. I looked out at the lake, watching a family of ducks paddle peacefully across the water. Then we proceed with everything. Full prosecution, maximum consequences, complete recovery of every stolen asset. 6 months later, I stood in a courtroom, watching Richard led away in handcuffs after receiving a 12-year sentence for elder financial abuse, fraud, and embezzlement. Jessica, who had cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a lighter sentence, received 3 years. But the real victory wasn't their punishment. It was what I'd built from the ashes of their betrayal. The Margaret Harrison Foundation had helped 43 elderly victims of family financial abuse in its first 6 months. We'd recovered over $2 million in stolen assets and provided legal representation to dozens of vulnerable adults who had nowhere else to turn. Today, I was interviewing Samantha Chen, a 26-year-old whose grandmother had been financially abused by a caregiver, for our new legal scholarship program. Mrs. Harrison, Samantha said as I showed her around our offices, I can't thank you enough for this opportunity. After what happened to my grandmother, I knew I wanted to fight for elderly people who couldn't fight for themselves. Samantha, I want you to understand something. This foundation exists because someone I loved chose cruelty over kindness. But it also exists because I learned that the worst things that happen to us can become the source of our greatest strength. That evening, I sat on my porch overlooking the lake, reading a letter that had arrived from Richard's prison. Mom, it began, I know you'll probably never forgive me, but I need you to know that I never meant for things to go as far as they did. I realize now what I threw away when I chose Jessica's version of success over our family's values. I'm sorry, Mom. I folded the letter and set it aside. Some apologies come when they can still repair damage. Others come when all they can do is acknowledge it. Richard would serve his full sentence. He would emerge in 12 years to find that his mother had built a legacy of protection for vulnerable elderly adults, and that the money he'd stolen had been transformed into something larger and more meaningful than he'd ever imagined possible. I would never forgive him. Forgiveness implied a relationship worth preserving, and Richard had destroyed that when he chose theft over honesty. But I no longer hated him either. Hatred was too expensive an emotion for someone who had discovered the power of channeling pain into purpose. As the sun set over my lake, I raised a glass of wine to the empty chair beside me. "We did it, Harold," I said quietly. "Justice served, victims protected, legacy preserved." Tomorrow, I would interview another scholarship candidate. Next week, I would testify at a legislative hearing about strengthening elder protection laws. The foundation would outlive me by decades, helping victims long after Richard learned to live with the consequences of his choices. I went inside to prepare for tomorrow's work, leaving the porch light on. Not because I was afraid of the dark, but because I wanted anyone who might be struggling in that darkness to know that somewhere, someone had found a way to turn pain into power, betrayal into purpose, and the worst day of their life into the first day of something better.